Mr. Roof, you're charged with 9 counts of murder and 1 count of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime.
Every fiber in my body hurts. And I'll never be the same.
How can you be the same after a racist spree killer murders your family for being a different color? This is Dylann Roof. In 2005, he entered the Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. There, he pulled out his gun and shot everyone in sight. This was made even worse by the fact that he was welcomed in with open arms before he killed everyone. How did a once happy boy with a loving mother end up radicalized, filled with hatred, and murderous? Let's explore the sinister story of Dylann Roof. We live in the 21st century, a century defined by humans trying hard to put hate, bigotry, and violence between them. So it's shocking and heartbreaking that a baby boy in the 1990s could think the way Dylann Roof did. Today's story begins in South Carolina, the state's largest city, Charleston. Charleston is home to 150,000 people and has a really dark history. During the colonial era, Charleston was a major slave trading port. Sadly, this would become appealing to Dylann Roof. Dylann was born on April 3, 1994, in Columbia, South Carolina, to his dad Ben and his mom Amy. Ben worked as a construction contractor and Amy was a bartender. By the time Dylann was born, they were already divorced, but they had reunited briefly to take care of their son. However, in 1999, Ben married another woman, Paige. So Dylann grew up with his dad and his 2 half-sisters, but the family never found stability. Ben and Paige's marriage broke apart within a decade after she had had enough verbal and physical abuse from him. On top of that, the family moved from town to town until around 2008. This was the life Dylann was exposed to, a violent, erratic father and an ever-changing scenery that didn't allow him to form close friendships. But Dylann didn't show signs of distress for a while. He was a happy-go-lucky boy who always smiled at the camera and seemed to have a good time wherever he went. No one in his family saw what was coming. His father remembers, "I don't know what happened. I just know that the boy wasn't raised that way." Whether Ben is just saying that to cover his own mistakes or he is genuinely shocked at what his son became, I guess we'll never know. However, it's safe to say verbal or physical abuse from a parent doesn't automatically make someone a racist murderer. At school, Dylann didn't leave much of an impression on his teachers. Asked about him years later, his teachers say they remember almost nothing about him. He wasn't rowdy or exceptionally conscientious. He was a regular kid, with one small exception. Dylann used hand sanitizer compulsively. Dylann's obsession with cleanliness was the only thing classmates remembered too. All but Caleb, Dylann's best friend from Columbia. He commented, "I just remember that he wasn't necessarily doing that good in school on the easy stuff. And it wasn't just books. In everything, he was just dull. He wasn't really street smart. Let's say we were at the park and we had to run away, he'd be kind of slow on getting what we needed to do." Here's an interesting twist. Caleb is black.
He had a small group of select friends. I was one of them. I'm obviously of color.
This wasn't a problem with young Dylann. He was a normal kid who loved everyone the same. But there was a kind of frustration that he was slowly beginning to feel, and it had little to do with race. Dylann's former school principal, Ted Watcher, explained that his frustration stemmed from being a working-class boy. To understand Dylann, you need to read The Hidden Injuries of Class, about how white working-class people in Boston, in South Boston, the more you interviewed them, what came out, especially after a few beers, is how inferior they felt to all the Harvard, Cambridge, bright, educated people. Basically, Dylann slowly became frustrated at how he always felt behind his peers. And as many of these were black, he remembered Charleston's history. Instead of being happy for those whose families escaped slavery and achieved an education, he was envious. And they say, "What are these people doing up there? What has happened to me?" By the time he dropped out of school at age 15, Dylann was a racist monster in the making. This is what he wrote on his website, thelastRhodesian.com. My blood is from mostly the British Isles, but I have been blessed with a significant amount of German blood and a German surname. My blood is representative of America. I wish with a passion that we're treated terribly throughout history by whites, that every white person had an ancestor who owned slaves. At the beginning of 2015, 20-year-old Dylann worked for Clark's Termite and Pest Control in Irmo. His boss and his coworkers noticed that Roof was often spaced or zoned out while working, that he would go sit somewhere else by himself, even though the rest of the crew was sitting together, and that he would fall asleep virtually any time he was stationary. Another said he once asked Roof about his hobbies, and Dylann said he did not do anything. He just went home and sat in his room. When the coworker asked Roof if he played video games, Roof said, "No, I literally look at the walls." Dylann had no friends and felt constantly depressed, as he would tell those who tried to connect with him. But in 2015, he created a Facebook account. He added 88 friends, and the majority of them were black kids who he went to school with. 88 because H is the 8th number of the alphabet, and 2 H's is the Nazi shorthand for Heil Hitler. On April 11th, 8 days after Dylann turned 21, the legal age for purchasing a gun in South Carolina, he took the money his father had given him for his birthday and drove to a gun store in West Columbia called Shooter's Choice, where he picked out a Glock .45 caliber pistol. But he already had a criminal record for drug possession, so he wasn't legally able to carry a gun. Dylann thus lied on his concealed weapon permit application and wrote no on the line that asked, "Are you an unlawful user of or addicted to marijuana or any depressant, stimulant, narcotic drug, or any other controlled substance?" Dylann was still using opioids at the time that he bought his gun. Perhaps the FBI should have done a background check when he bought it, or perhaps the store should have checked Dylann's record. As it turns out, the FBI did conduct a check, only their answer came 2.5 months after Dylann's purchase. It was 1 minute too late. 9 people were dead. On June 17, 2015, 12 churchgoers gathered at the Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. It was a Wednesday, and on that day, every week, they would meet for Bible study. This wasn't just about religion, it was about community too. These people were very close to each other, and they loved hanging out every week. But that day, an unfamiliar face would turn up at the church too. That's right, Dylann opened the church's doors and stepped in. The other people thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was a local college kid, they thought. Maybe he was studying theology, race studies, or history. So they welcomed him kindly and offered him a seat. Reverend Clementa Pickney personally pulled out a chair for Dylann. He was the first to be shot with 3 bullets. Within minutes, 9 out of the 12 people were butchered. Dylann pulled out his gun and shot everyone. 2 of the 3 survivors were a woman, Felicia Sanders and her granddaughter. The woman had to lie down in her own son's blood, covering her granddaughter's mouth so Dylann wouldn't hear her whimpers. They played dead, hoping Dylann would leave. The 3rd survivor was a 72-year-old Polly Shepard. Dylann left her alive to tell the story, believing Felicia and her granddaughter were dead.
Please answer.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
Please, Emanuel Church, there's plenty of people shot down here. Please send somebody right away.
Emanuel Church?
Emanuel, yeah, he shot the pastor, he shot all the men in the church. Please come right away.
Imagine what this does to the survivors, their families, and all those who thought these days were over. At the time of the murders, Dylann was living in a Red Bank community trailer south of Lexington, sleeping on the couch of his former high school buddy, Joseph Meek. It turns out that Joseph shared some of Dylann's interests, and the two reconnected with each other after years of silence. They would spend most of their days doing drugs and playing video games. One time, Joseph had several friends over, and Dylann confessed he was planning to shoot people at Charleston University. When his friends pressed him about it, he refused to explain. Later on, Dylann told Joseph he was planning to conduct his shooting spree at the Emanuel Church. Joseph later said he didn't take him seriously, then that Dylann begged him not to tell anyone. So Joseph didn't call the police before or after the tragedy. After taking 9 lives in just a few minutes, Dylann attempted to take his own life, but he'd run out of bullets. So at 9:06, he left the church. Straight after, Dylann drove over to the branch AME Church in Somerville. Dylann stopped in front of the church for 3 minutes. There was supposed to be a Bible study meeting there too, but that day it had been canceled. The police would find several church targets written down at Dylann's home, but Dylann wasn't immediately apprehended. In fact, the police were desperate to identify the man seen on the church's CCTV. As soon as his picture came on TVs all across the country, Dylann's own family phoned the police and identified him. But by now, Dylann was on the run. Luckily, a North Carolina florist recognized his car and phoned the police's tip line.
Something just kept telling me, there's something about that car.
Dylann was thus tracked down to Shelby, North Carolina, 250 miles away from the church. During the interrogation, it was clear just how clear Dylann's reasoning was.
Can you tell us about what happened last night?
Whoa. Yeah, I mean, I went to that church in Charleston, and, I did it.
So you shot him?
Yes.
What kind of gun did you use?
A Glock 45.
Okay.
How long were you at the church before you actually, before you pulled your weapon out? You said yourself you shot, you think, maybe 5 or so people. How long were you at the church before you decided that you were going to do that?
Well, I just went in the church, and then I sat down with them for like maybe 15 minutes.
Dylann let the churchgoers introduce themselves to him, welcome him to their table, and invite him to pray. When they closed their eyes to pray, that's when he pulled out his gun. Toward the end of the interrogation, Dylann finally addressed the elephant in the room, his sinister motive. Just listen to his disturbing view.
The fact of the matter is, what I did is so minuscule to what they're doing to white people every day, all the time. And just because that doesn't get on the news doesn't mean it's not happening. Everybody knows that the news is biased for black people. We can pretend it's not, but it is.
When he was asked if he had any remorse for what he'd done, he said that he felt he needed to do it, and he still feels that way.
I had to do it because nobody else is going to do it. Nobody else is brave enough to do anything about it, Back in the late 80s and the early 90s, we had skinheads and stuff like that. There's no skinheads left. There's no KKK. KKK never did anything anyway.
Wow. As the investigators checked Dylann's past, one thing became clear. He'd become self-indoctrined on the internet. His family did not share his views, and in fact, Dylann had complained about not having someone to talk to. In other words, not having who to cast racial slurs with. Dylann had never met any white supremacists physically, and he never signed up for any organizations. And while he was publicly identified as the killer, Dylann's family found it hard to believe that it was their son or brother. He hadn't discussed his thoughts or feelings with them for quite some time. In a way, they were as shocked and confused as the churchgoers' families. Who was this man? How did he get so low? This became the million-dollar question. What happened to Dylann? Sure, he'd come from an unstable family, and he had his frustrations, but not all people with unstable families or drug addictions end up like Dylann. In fact, very, very few of them do. And it's even rarer for people born in the 1990s.
Mr. Roof, you're charged with 9 counts of murder and 1 count of possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime.
Needless to say, everyone was appalled at Dylann's horrific crime, from the authorities to the judge and the South Carolina communities. There was very little his defense team could do. How do you defend someone who did that, and who stated what he did during the interrogation?
It seems the defense is in a really tough position here. Sure looks like there's a lot of evidence against him. The interesting question is going to be, what if he says, I'll plead guilty, but you've got to take the death penalty off the table? In many, many cases, prosecutors would accept that. In this case, I think they probably won't.
Dylann also couldn't go with the insanity route. His motive was all too clear.
He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was doing it because he wanted to kill people, because he hated them.
The police unearthed a horrible list of photos showing Dylann wearing a jacket with 2 patches, one for apartheid and one for the former Rhodesia. Sheesh. But at his trial, it wasn't those abominable moments that were remembered, but Dylann's 9 victims. Clementa Pickney, Tyanza Sanders, Cynthia Hurd, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Mira Thompson, Ethel Lance, Daniel Simmons, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Susie Jackson.
It makes absolutely no sense at all. And that's why I say I still can't even really fathom that it was him that committed all of those heinous crimes.
Dylann left loved ones, acquaintances, victims, and a whole world in shock. Yet, his victims' families found it in their hearts to forgive him.
The last family is going to be okay. And that's all I have to say.
How do you express forgiveness down there?
I'm a Christian woman. I believe in God.
Dylann found forgiveness for the worst crime imaginable from his victims. He could never understand the love, empathy, and kindness that other people have. On January 11th, 2017, Dylann was sentenced to death. 2 months later, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. Surprisingly, his plea was accepted, but that won't amount to much. Dylann was sentenced to 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his life in a sad little headspace with no friends, no love, and no hope. Perhaps that's the biggest punishment someone can get, and in the case of Dylann, I think we can say it's warranted. Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on this case? What is the appropriate punishment for someone like Dylann? And could his downfall have been prevented? Let me know in the comment section, and before you leave, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time.